Hello, welcome back to Bonaventure Time. Today I want to continue kind of an aesthetic run I talked about is beauty objective in my last video. If you haven't checked that out, I would go check it out. I think it's an interesting question. I'd be curious what you think about that question. Um, Today I want to talk about Mikel Dufrenne. I mentioned him in, I believe, my very first video, and I realized I haven't talked about him, and I think he's a great philosopher, um, at least in the aesthetic field. So yeah, I want to talk about his aesthetics, his phenomenology of aesthetic experience. Um, as its name implies, it's about aesthetics, and he's a phenomenologist. I think he does wonderful work and makes great contributions to the aesthetic field and to phenomenology, and to the works of imagination, following a Husserlian imagination. But we'll get into that. So, without further ado, let's do it. Um, I'm just going to talk about some key concepts in Mikel Dufrenne. It's a very thick work. It's very rich, but it's very dense and it's very thick. It's well past 400 to 500 pages, which is like Hildebrand's aesthetics, but so it's easier to just kind of talk about certain concepts that kind of help. Perhaps this video can be a guide for you reading it more so than me kind of just pouring out all its content to you. Um, so I would say the first key concept that is helpful to bring up is presence. I talked about this in my Husserl video, but presence for Mikel Dufrenne is very important because it's a work of arts, aesthetic objects. He's really trying to answer that question: when does a work of art become an aesthetic object? And for him, he wants to understand that work of arts, or works of art, I should say, have an equivocal existence. And what he means by that is, in one sense, you could be present to a work of art in the sense that you are conscious of a musical sheet of paper in front of you. But in another sense, you could be totally absent to its presence in the sense that you may not be able to read that musical sheet, or you may be deaf and you can't hear it being played, right? Or the fact that you just aren't hearing it being played, that no one's performing it. Um, so there's an equivocal existence, he notes, to a work of art, right? So, um, you need to perform an action, right? He's following Husserl's phenomenology here to bring you in correlation with the work of art, right? To allow you to be fully conscious of its true presence, right? So that's the first big theme for Dufresne. The second big theme is performance, right? And that's where he kind of gets into this phenomenology and bracketing kind of idea that Husserl talks about in his logical investigations and the ideas, right? Performance allows you to be in full correlation with this experiencing or with the appearing object, right? So for him, he talks about it a lot in the context of theater, right? So the performance of the actors is what manifests the aesthetic object to the viewer, right? So it no longer just remains a work of art, but it becomes an aesthetic object because you come to its full meaning, right? Because you're conscious of its true presence, right? So performance is a huge key for Mikel Dufrenne, and I think it's very interesting how he lays it out, and it allows you to contemplate its meaning, right? And I think I used in my Husserl video the book, right? If you perform the action of understanding the language and reading a book, you come to the meaning, and no longer is it just a work of art, something that ontologically exists. It has this sort of new ontological change to it that Dufresne calls it, and it really becomes an aesthetic object, right? Because you perceive the object for its own sake, the work of art for its own sake. Um, and for him, he claims that the aesthetic object is the work of art fully appreciated as a work of art. That's what it means to be an aesthetic object. But what's interesting, and this is another key theme for him, is this means that the viewer is integral to the aesthetic object because the viewer has to contemplate the meaning of this work of art to come to the aesthetic object, which means that also the aesthetic object can be lost. While you're always in front and in some way present to the work of art, you can choose to actually be absent to the aesthetic object. In fact, even if you come to the aesthetic object, say you contemplate something as great as Les Mis, right? You can lose sight of its aesthetic object if you choose to not appreciate it for its own sake as a work of art. If you're, say, non-intentional, to use phenomenological language, right? So that's a big theme for Dufresne, is he's actually emphasizing the need for the viewer. He's not saying, I want to clarify, he's not saying that beauty's subjective. He's just really showing in the context of theater, right, the viewer is very important to manifest the full reality of the aesthetic object. The viewer has a dignified role. So we've talked about presence, we've talked about performance, the viewer, right? Another huge theme, and this goes in line with the viewer, is imagination. And this is something so fascinating for Dufresne. I think he does a wonderful job on explaining the role of the imagination. For him, the imagination does not add anything to the aesthetic object, but it actually helps put, as he says in quote, puts the real into perspective. Though not real in itself, the imagination puts the real into perspective. And what he means by that is the imagination is what allows you to fully contemplate the work of art for its own sake, to come to its full meaning and depth, right? And he loves to talk about an actor dying, right? You in your just perception, you know that it's just acting, right? That someone has, as Husserl would say, fantasy died, right? They didn't actually die, but the actor or the character died, right? And Dufresne takes note of this and says, yes, like you perceive that the person did not die. That's why you don't call 911, right? Right? No ambulance comes. But he also notes that the imagination is what allows you to enter into the fantasy realm and what allows you to evoke real feelings, right? Think about a Les Mis, right? The feelings that are elicited when you see the conversion of Jean Valjean, or think about the noble death of, say, right, um Enjolras, or right, those people who nobly die, right? Or think about the emotions and the joy that comes, right, when someone comes home in one of those movies, right? So the point Dufresne's trying to make is the imagination allows you to feel real feelings. The real feelings are there. You know that person didn't die, right? And he talks about this. Yet you're still emotional about it because the imagination allows you to enter into that fantasy realm, allows you to really penetrate into the inner depth of the mystery of this aesthetic object. And in that way, the imagination becomes integral for you to come to the meaning of this work of art and thereby the aesthetic object. So I think he does a wonderful job, and that's a huge theme in Dufresne's aesthetics, is the imagination. He borrows a lot from Husserlian imagination because it was Husserl who really kind of flipped the script on the imagination and its role in epistemological experience. Oftentimes, imagination was associated, and I still hear it today, being associated with, right, what's it's just in your imagination, right? You're just, you're just dreaming, or right, it speaks a lot about elusiveness, right? But Husserl was the first to kind of put into perspective and say, actually, the imagination puts a lot of things into his perspective. It actually helps you understand reality. And Dufresne's picking that up and he's putting it into an aesthetic context. Although certainly he has his own section. I believe it's part 3. He talks about it in greater depth and kind of its role just even outside aesthetics. He talks about how reality can be present even within imagination. He uses the example of the effects, I believe it's the effects of wind, or no, it's the effects of falling within a dream, right? You feel the air, right? You feel the effects, you feel real effects, things posited of reality in dreams, such as falling, right? So there's things within the imagination that you actually come to know reality. Hence Dufresne says, though not real in itself, it puts the real into perspective. So I would say that those are the biggest themes for Dufresne: is presence, performance, the viewer, contemplation along with that, and then the imagination. And with that, Dufresne really comes to this idea that the work of art then becomes an aesthetic object when it meets that criteria. And it's nothing other than the work of art perceived for its own sake, appreciated for its own sake. So I hope this video was interesting. I hope you find Dufresne's aesthetics as interesting as I do. I know I didn't really go into great depth in this video. Like I said, it's just a really dense and large work, and I feel like I could just talk about it for so long and throw a ton of content that would need a lot of qualifications. So I hope that this really can just be a guide for you to actually explore Dufresne's aesthetics yourself. But if not, at least introduce you to some important themes. I think not only within Dufresne's account, but I think phenomenology and aesthetics. So I hope this video helps, and I hope that those principles pique an interest in aesthetics. And I hope you like this video. Please share it. Please subscribe if you have not. And I hope you have a good rest of your day. God bless.